My father used my worst memory to entertain a room full of strangers. A few months later, I used his worst memory to empty one. My dad, Curtis Vale, had spent most of his adult life calling himself a comic storyteller. That title sounded impressive until you learned what it actually meant. 25 years of unpaid open mic nights in half-empty pubs around Portland, 7-minute sets between karaoke singers, and a stack of homemade business cards that listed him as an entertainer, even though nobody had ever hired him twice. Curtis believed every room existed for one reason: to listen to him. He was loud, fast, charming when he wanted to be, and completely unable to let another person keep ownership of an embarrassing moment. If something painful happened near him, he treated it like abandoned property. He picked it up, polished it into a story, added a voice that sounded nothing like the person involved, and repeated it until strangers laughed. Most of those stories were about me.
When I was 6, I got trapped in a department store elevator for 11 minutes. I screamed so hard that I lost my voice. My father did not remember the part where I clawed at the doors or the part where I slept with my bedroom light on for 2 years afterward. He remembered the noise I made. At family dinners, he would throw his head back and imitate it like a dying kettle. Then he would point at me and say, "That little siren grew up to be my son." When I was 9, I froze during a school spelling contest and forgot how to spell the word window. Curtis turned it into a routine about raising a child who could look through glass but could not identify it. He told that one so often that people who barely knew me would greet me by asking whether I had finally learned to spell. When I was 12, I developed a nervous twitch in my left eye after my mother left. He built an entire character around it. At dinner, he would wink uncontrollably and pretend to flirt with the salt shaker. He called it affection. He said men in our family showed love by giving each other material. But he never used himself as material. That was the rule I understood long before anyone said it aloud. Curtis could expose anyone, but nobody was allowed to expose Curtis. His failures were tragedies. Mine were punchlines. He carried a black pocket notebook everywhere. I hated that notebook more than I hated his drinking, more than I hated the stale smell of his jackets, maybe even more than I hated the sound of his stage laugh. Whenever something happened to me, I would see his hand move toward his back pocket. A scraped knee, the notebook. A panic attack before a class presentation, the notebook. The first girl who rejected me, the notebook. Sometimes he wrote while I was still crying. He would crouch beside me like a concerned father, ask 1 or 2 questions, then glance away and scribble down the answer before it disappeared. Years later, I realized he had never been comforting me. He had been interviewing me. I learned to hide every important feeling. I learned to cry silently in locked bathrooms. I learned to answer "fine" before anyone finished asking how I was. I learned that privacy was not something Curtis respected. It was simply information he had not discovered yet. The worst incident before the engagement party happened when I was 15. My mother had been gone for 3 years, and I still kept an old voicemail from her on a broken phone in my desk. It was only 19 seconds long. She said she was sorry, that she loved me, and that she would call again soon. She never did. One night, Curtis found the phone while searching my room for cash. He listened to the message. Then, the following Friday, he played it through the sound system at a neighborhood barbecue. He introduced it like an audio clip from a documentary. "Here," he announced to 12 adults holding paper plates, "is the rare call of the disappearing mother." Then he pressed play.
People did not know whether to laugh. A few did, because Curtis was already laughing, and laughter is contagious, even when it is cruel. I stood beside the picnic table while my mother's voice came through a cheap speaker, promising to call a boy she had already abandoned. When the message ended, Curtis added, "Still waiting, folks. Maybe she has bad reception." That line got the biggest laugh. Later, when I confronted him, he said I was being dramatic. He said pain became harmless once you could joke about it. He said he was helping me. That was his favorite defense. He hurt people for their own good. For years, I assumed every family worked this way. I thought fathers collected weaknesses the way other men collected tools. I thought love meant giving someone access to the weapon they would eventually use against you. Then I met Elise. She was the first person who treated my secrets like something to protect, not something to perform. Around her, silence finally felt safe.
Elise came from a world that made me feel unfinished. Her father, Martin, owned a construction company. Her mother organized charity dinners and remembered every birthday. Their house had family photographs in every hallway. When they told stories about each other, the stories ended with affection. I had been with Elise for almost 4 years when I proposed. Her parents offered to host the engagement dinner at the Hawthorne Conservatory, a glass building above the river. Nearly 150 guests were invited. Relatives, business partners, old friends, and people whose approval mattered. For weeks, I felt like I was preparing for an exam. I bought a new suit. I memorized the names of Elise's uncles. I practiced introducing myself without sounding nervous. I told myself that if the evening went smoothly, maybe her family would stop seeing me as the strange man with the vague childhood. There was only one problem. My father expected an invitation. I considered lying about the date or claiming the venue had limited space, but every excuse sounded cowardly. Despite everything, some part of me wanted him there. I wanted Curtis to see the life I had built without him. I wanted him to see Elise take my hand when I went quiet. I wanted him to understand that I had become someone he could not reduce to a humiliating story. More than anything, I wanted him to be proud. A week before the dinner, I visited his apartment. It looked exactly as it had when I was 16. Notebooks, empty mugs, unopened mail, and old comedy flyers. I told him the rules clearly. No stories about me. No childhood jokes. No microphone. This matters to Elise and to me. He placed a hand over his heart. You think I can't behave for one evening? I know you can, I said. I'm asking whether you will. He promised. He said this was not one of his bars. He would shake hands, drink slowly, and say something kind and leave early. I wanted to believe him badly enough to ignore the glance he gave the notebook beside his elbow. On the night of the dinner, Curtis arrived 40 minutes late and smelling of bourbon. He wore a silver jacket with black lapels and a red pocket square. He looked less like the father of the groom and more like a magician who had lost his equipment. Within 10 minutes, he introduced himself to Martin's partners as the talent in the family. Within 20, he told a waitress that I had been terrified of elevators until high school. I pulled him aside near the coat room. You promised me. I'm making conversation, he said. That story is not conversation. People laughed. That was always his final argument. I spent the next hour interrupting stories, replacing bourbon with water, and steering him away from anyone holding a phone. For a while, I thought I had contained him. Then the main course ended. The pianist stopped. Waiters began clearing glasses. Curtis stood. He picked up a dessert spoon and struck it against his champagne flute. Once. Twice. Then again. Louder. Every face in the conservatory turned toward him. Before he spoke, I knew exactly what he was about to take from me.
Curtis smiled as if the entire evening had been arranged for him. I'll keep this short, he said, which was the first lie. A few guests laughed politely. He began with harmless things. He said Elise had excellent judgment in everything except men. He said he had spent years wondering whether anyone would ever be patient enough to marry me. Then he said, but there's one story that really explains my boy. My hands went cold. When I was 20, I disappeared for 2 days. I had lost my job, stopped sleeping, and convinced myself everyone I loved would be better off without me. Curtis found me in a motel outside Salem and drove me to a psychiatric clinic. I stayed there for 4 nights. It was the most frightening period of my life. Elise knew I had struggled when I was younger, but she did not know the full story. I planned to tell her privately, somewhere she could ask questions and I could answer without feeling like a defendant. Curtis told everyone first. He described the motel room, the bottles on the floor, and the way I looked when he found me. Then he started imitating me. He bent his shoulders, made his voice thin and childish, and repeated words I had said during the drive. Words spoken while I was terrified and barely conscious. The laughter stopped. Curtis did not. Whenever a joke failed, he believed the problem was delivery, so he raised his voice and added details. He acted out my shaking hands. He mimed the receptionist asking whether I was dangerous. He made a joke about the plastic bracelet around my wrist. A woman at the nearest table lowered her glass. Martin's business partners disappeared first. Elise's grandmother walked past me without speaking. Her mother squeezed my arm gently, which somehow felt worse than anger. Elise asked me to drive her home. During the ride, she stared out the window. I tried to explain, but every sentence sounded like an excuse because Curtis had already given her the loud version. His version had gestures, voices, and a punchline. Mine was only the truth. At her apartment, she finally turned to me. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was going to." "When?" "I don't know. Soon." She nodded, but the answer had come too late. That night, she asked me to leave. And while I sat alone in my car outside her building, my father sent me a message. "Great room! They were stiff, but I think I won them over."
For the next 3 days, Elise barely answered my calls. When she finally agreed to meet, we sat in a coffee shop near her office, surrounded by strangers pretending not to listen. She asked questions I had hoped to answer differently. Had it happened more than once? Was I taking medication? Could it happen again? Did anyone in my family have the same problems? That last question stayed with me. My father had not only exposed a private crisis, he had shown Elise exactly what kind of home I came from. I told her the truth. It had been one crisis, years ago. I had gone to therapy. I had changed my life. I had built routines and friendships I could depend on. I had survived it. For 2 months we attended counseling together. I repeated the story in the correct order, without voices or jokes. Slowly, Elise understood the difference between a past emergency and a permanent danger. She came back. But something between us had changed. Before the dinner, my history had belonged to me. Afterward, it lived in every room with her family. Her mother became careful around me. At gatherings, people watched my face whenever a conversation became tense. Nobody said anything cruel. They did something worse. They treated me as fragile. 6 weeks later, I learned that Curtis had turned the disaster into a new routine. A bartender sent me a message. "Your dad did 10 minutes about the fancy party last night. Said rich people can't take a joke. Crowd loved it." He had taken my breakdown and used it to destroy the evening. Then he had taken the destroyed evening and turned that into material too. There was no event terrible enough to stop the machine. I called him. "You made that dinner into a bit?" "It's comedy," he said. "You use what happens." "You humiliated me." "I made you memorable." "You nearly ended my engagement." There was a pause. Then I heard the scratch of a pen. "That's a strong line," he said. "Say it again." I hung up. The wedding was 4 months away, and Curtis assumed he would give a speech. He began texting ideas for his Father of the Groom set. He requested embarrassing stories about Elise so the jokes would feel balanced. He ordered a white dinner jacket covered in gold patterns. I told him there would be no speech. He laughed. "You can't have a wedding and silence the groom's father." I sent the boundary in writing. No speech, no microphone, no stories. If you cannot accept that, do not come. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. An hour later, the venue coordinator called Elise. Curtis had contacted her directly. He introduced himself as a professional performer and asked when he could have 8 to 10 minutes.
That evening, I drove to his apartment. "You agreed," I said. "I agreed not to give a speech." "You called the venue." "For a tribute." "That is a speech." "A tribute can have music." He smiled as though he had found a loophole. For the first time, I understood that boundaries meant nothing to him. Every rule was another setup he believed he could outsmart. I could not keep him away from a microphone by asking. So I decided to give him one.
The idea formed slowly over the next 2 weeks. I did not want to fight Curtis anymore. Fighting only gave him another story. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose control of a room. So I called him and apologized. I said I had overreacted after the engagement dinner. I told him Elise's family had made me ashamed of where I came from, and that I had unfairly blamed him. He was silent for several seconds. Then his voice softened. "I knew you'd come around." I told him I wanted to organize a small pre-wedding gathering for his friends. Nothing formal, just drinks, food, and a chance for the people from his comedy scene to meet me properly. Curtis loved the idea. He said it was time I stopped pretending I was better than regular people. He said maybe I had finally inherited his sense of humor. That sentence hurt more than I expected. For one brief moment, he sounded proud of me. I reminded myself that he was proud only because he believed I had surrendered. Curtis invited everyone himself. There was Leonard, who had performed the same jokes about his divorce for 15 years. Maya, who was genuinely talented but never escaped the basement clubs. Joel, who called shouting at strangers crowd work. And Dennis, Curtis's closest friend, although they had accused each other of stealing material more times than I could count. 17 people agreed to come. I rented the private room of a pub called the Lantern House. It had brick walls, a small stage, and a microphone attached to a long black cable. I chose it because Curtis had performed there for years. He would feel safe. I paid for the drinks and told everyone the evening would include a friendly roast. The theme was parents. Each person would tell a few funny stories about the mother or father who raised them. Curtis thought it was brilliant. He slapped my shoulder and announced to the room that his son had finally become interesting. Then, before I had even finished explaining the rules, he took the microphone. Of course, he went first. He opened with the elevator story. He screamed into the microphone, imitating 6-year-old me while everyone laughed. Then came the spelling contest, the nervous eye twitch, and the voicemail from my mother. I had not expected him to use that one again. He recreated her voice, then looked directly at me and said, "Don't worry, son. I'm sure she'll call any decade now." Several people laughed. A few looked uncomfortable. Curtis did not notice the difference. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes on a stage I had rented, drinking alcohol I had purchased, humiliating me in front of people I had invited. When he finished, he returned to his chair glowing with satisfaction. He winked at me. It was a slow, confident wink, as though we were finally partners. I smiled back. Other people took their turns. Maya told a funny story about her mother secretly returning every gift she received. Leonard described his father teaching him to drive by screaming prayers from the passenger seat. Their stories were sharp, but there was warmth beneath them. That was the difference. They mocked people they still loved. Curtis mocked people so he would not have to love them. After 20 minutes, Dennis lifted his glass and called my name. Curtis began clapping before I stood. "That's my boy," he shouted. "Show them what you've got." I walked onto the stage. I took the microphone from the stand and looked at the 17 people Curtis had gathered. Then I looked at my father. He leaned back in his chair, smiling, completely certain he knew what was about to happen. He did not. "I want to tell you a story," I began, "about the year my father turned 18. Curtis's smile disappeared before I reached the second sentence. My father had always told people that his own father died when he was young. It was one of his favorite stories, a grieving mother, a teenage boy forced to become the man of the house. He used it whenever someone questioned his drinking, his temper,
or the way he treated me. But his father had not died. His name was Raymond Vale, and he had lived 30 miles away for most of Curtis's life. I told the room how Curtis discovered that Raymond had started a second family in Eugene. Instead of confronting him, Curtis began visiting him in secret. Raymond gave him money to stay quiet. At first it was $20, then $50. Eventually, Curtis learned that silence could become an income. For years, whenever he needed rent, alcohol, or money for another comedy workshop, he made the same phone call. "Pay me, or I tell them who I am." Curtis shifted in his chair. "That's not what happened," he said. I kept speaking. When Raymond became ill, Curtis visited him in the hospital. Not to forgive him, not to say goodbye. He demanded one final payment. Raymond refused. So Curtis appeared at the family home during the funeral and introduced himself to two grieving daughters as the brother their father had hidden from them. He told them in the driveway while they were carrying flowers inside. Then he asked whether Raymond had left him anything. The room had stopped moving. Curtis stood. "That's enough." I looked directly at him. "You told me never to waste the truth." He reached toward the microphone cable, but Dennis caught his arm. "Sit down," Dennis said. It was the first time I had heard one of Curtis's friends speak to him without laughter in his voice. I continued. "My grandmother had left me $28,000 for college. Curtis controlled the account because I was 16. By the time I graduated, $93 remained. He told me the market had collapsed. The market had not collapsed. He had spent the money on bars, gambling, and a comedy course in Los Angeles. He returned after 3 weeks because the instructor told him he relied too much on humiliating people. Curtis called the instructor a fraud. Several people looked down. They had all heard him complain about that course. They had heard him say he sacrificed his own savings to chase a dream. It had never been his money. I listed the jobs he lost: the warehouse, the hotel kitchen, the furniture store, the delivery company. At every job, something disappeared shortly before Curtis was fired. "Lies," he said. "This is all lies." But nobody looked convinced. They knew him too well. Then I told them about the night he came to my apartment asking for money. When I refused, he punched through the bathroom door and told my landlord I had done it during one of my episodes. He had used my medical history as protection for his own violence. That was the part that changed the room. Maya slowly placed her glass on the table. "You said he attacked you?" she said to Curtis. He looked at her, then at me. For once he had no answer ready. I had spent my whole life watching him transform facts into jokes. Now I was doing the opposite. I was taking every joke he had told and returning the missing facts. And with each fact, the version of Curtis they thought they knew became harder to see.
I told them about the winter I was 11, when our electricity was shut off for 9 days. Curtis had told everyone the power company made a mistake. He said we were victims of a clerical error and joked about cooking canned soup over candles like pioneers. The truth was that he had spent the utility money on a weekend comedy festival in Seattle. While he stayed in a hotel, I slept in our apartment wearing 2 coats. I did homework beneath the emergency light in the hallway because it was the only place in the building that stayed bright. When he returned, he brought me a souvenir T-shirt. It was 3 sizes too large and had the festival logo across the chest. For years, he told that story as proof that I had been an ungrateful child. I told them about Christmas when I was 13. My aunt had bought me a used electric guitar. It was the first expensive thing anyone had trusted me with. I played it every day until my fingertips split. 2 weeks later, it disappeared. Curtis said someone must have broken into the apartment, although the lock had not been damaged and nothing else was missing. I found the pawn ticket in his jacket. He had sold it for $180. When I confronted him, he said the money went toward groceries. That night, I found a receipt from a casino outside Tacoma for almost the same amount. Across the room, Leonard closed his eyes.
Curtis had told his friends for years that I abandoned music because I was lazy. They had heard him joke about buying a guitar for a son who lacked discipline. Now they knew he had sold it. I described the night child services came to our apartment. A teacher had noticed bruises on my arm after Curtis dragged me out of bed during an argument. Before the social worker arrived, he made me practice a story. I had fallen from my bicycle. He repeated it until I could say it without pausing. Then he sat beside me during the interview, one hand resting on my shoulder, pressing harder whenever my answer changed. Afterward, he congratulated me. "See," he said, "you can perform when it matters." Curtis pushed his chair back. The legs scraped across the floor. "You invited me here to ambush me." "No," I said. "I invited your audience." That sentence landed harder than anything else. He looked around the room as if only then remembering that other people were present. I told them about his 4 attempts at rehabilitation. He left the first program because the counselors would not allow him to smoke indoors. He left the second because another patient accused him of stealing. He left the third after turning a group session into a comedy routine about everyone else's addictions. The 4th time, he called me from a bus station and asked for money to get home. I was 22 and working 2 jobs. I sent it. He spent half of it at a bar before reaching the bus. Curtis looked toward Dennis. "Come on," he said. "You know how he exaggerates." Dennis did not answer. So Curtis tried Leonard. Then Maya. One by one, his eyes moved across the people who had laughed at his stories for years. Nobody rescued him. I told them the final thing. The voicemail from my mother, the one Curtis had played at the barbecue, had not been the last message she left. There had been another call 3 months later. Curtis answered it. My mother asked to speak with me. She said she was sober, living in Spokane, and wanted to meet. Curtis told her I hated her. Then he erased the message and never told me she had called. I discovered the truth years later when I found a letter she had sent him. She died before I could ask her about it. For the first time that evening, my voice almost broke. Curtis stared at me. "That isn't fair," he whispered. I tightened my grip on the microphone. "No," I said, "it isn't." Then Maya stood, took her coat from the back of her chair, and walked toward the door.
The door closed behind Maya. Nobody moved for a second. Then Leonard stood. He did not look at Curtis. He folded his coat over one arm, placed a few bills beneath his glass, and walked out with his head lowered. That was enough. Another chair scraped back, then another. The room began emptying slowly, almost politely, as if everyone was afraid that moving too quickly would turn the moment into a scene. Dennis stayed seated longer than the others. Curtis watched him desperately. "You know me," my father said. "You know what he's like when he gets emotional." Dennis stared at the table. "I know what you told us," he said. "Exactly. And now I know what you left out." Curtis opened his mouth, but Dennis was already standing. He looked at me before leaving. There was no apology in his expression. An apology would have been too easy. What I saw was something heavier, the realization that he had laughed at stories that should never have been funny. Then he walked out. Within 2 minutes, 17 people became 3. Joel lingered near the back wall with his phone held against his chest. A small red light glowed beside the camera. He had recorded everything. Curtis noticed it at the same time I did. "Delete that," he said. Joel did not respond. "I said delete it." Curtis moved toward him, but Joel stepped backward and slipped through the door. The recording went with him. I had not planned that. I had wanted the people in the room to know the truth. I had not thought about the truth leaving the room, entering group chats, reaching every bar and basement stage where Curtis had spent his life. But when I saw the panic in his face, part of me was glad. That frightened me. The bartender entered, glanced at the abandoned drinks, and quietly left again. Now only Curtis and I remained. The microphone was still in my hand. The stage lights were still on. My father sat in the middle of a room full of empty chairs, surrounded by the evidence of people who had chosen to leave rather than stay beside him. For once, he had the spotlight entirely to himself. He looked smaller beneath it. "You ruined me," he said. His voice was not loud. It was not the voice he used on stage. There was no rhythm, no performance, no hint that he was searching for a punchline. It sounded old. I placed the microphone back in its stand. "You told the truth about me," he continued. "But you made it sound ugly." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sentence was so perfectly him. "I didn't make it ugly." "You didn't tell them the reasons." "What reasons?" "I was young. I was drinking. I was trying to survive." "So was I." He looked away. His beer sat untouched on the table, warm and flat. One of his hands trembled beside it. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father. Not fear of losing me. He had never been afraid of that. Fear of losing the audience. His friends were the only witnesses who supported the version of himself he had built. Around them, he was not a thief, a drunk, or a cruel father. He was Curtis Vale, the veteran comic with 1,000 stories. Now those stories had been returned to their owners. Without them, he had nothing left. He pointed toward the door. "They'll never let me perform again." "You can find new rooms." "They'll send that video everywhere." "Then you'll be memorable." His face tightened. I had repeated his own word, but he did not recognize it as a gift.
He recognized it as a weapon. "You're just like me," he whispered. That was the only thing he said that truly hurt, because part of me wondered whether he was right. I had planned the evening carefully. I had gathered his friends, chosen his stage, and waited until he felt safe before taking everything from him. I had learned how to do that by watching him. The difference was that Curtis destroyed people for laughter. I had destroyed him for silence. I picked up my jacket. He said my name as I turned away. Not loudly, not angrily. It sounded like a question. I stopped with my hand on the door, but I did not look back. For 30 years, he had taught me that every painful moment belonged to whoever could tell it best. That night, I finally told mine. Then I left him alone beneath the stage lights, with no audience left to laugh.
For 3 days, Curtis did not call me. Normally, silence was something he filled immediately. If I ignored one call, he left 6 messages. If I refused to argue, he invented both sides and performed them into my voicemail. But after the night at the Lantern House, there was nothing. Then the video appeared. Joel uploaded 9 minutes, beginning with the story about my grandfather and ending with Maya leaving. He posted my voice, my father's face, and the room slowly realizing what it had been laughing at. By morning, the clip had spread through every comedy group in Portland. By afternoon, 3 bars removed Curtis from their schedules. By evening, strangers were discussing him online as if they had known him forever. Some called him abusive, some called me cruel. A few said it had to be staged because real families did not speak to each other like that in public. Curtis finally called it midnight. "You need to make a statement," he said. I was lying beside Elise in the dark. "What kind?" "Tell them you were angry. Tell them you exaggerated." I didn't. "Tell them it was a roast." It was. His breathing sharpened. "They're canceling me." "You were barely booked." "That isn't the point." It was exactly the point. For 30 years, he had insisted consequences did not matter as long as the room laughed. Now the room had stopped laughing, and consequences were suddenly sacred. He asked me to contact Joel. He asked me to threaten him. He said he would sue the pub, the comedians, and me. Then he began crying. I had heard Curtis imitate crying hundreds of times. This was different. There was no rhythm to it, no pause waiting for a reaction. "I'm your father," he said. The words should have moved me. Instead, they made me tired. You remembered that too late. I ended the call. The next morning, Elise found me at the kitchen table. "Do you feel better?" she asked. "No." "Do you regret it?" "I don't know." That was the truth.
Part of me felt lighter. For the first time, the people around Curtis knew that his stories had victims. But I also understood that I had chosen humiliation because humiliation was the only justice I had ever been taught. Elise reached across the table. "I understand why you did it," she said. "But is this finished?" She was asking whether Curtis would be allowed to enter our marriage again, not physically, but as a force, another emergency, another room destroyed from a distance. "Yes," I said. This time I meant it. That afternoon, I removed Curtis from the wedding guest list. I changed the venue passwords, gave his photograph to security, and told every vendor that only Elise and I could alter the schedule. Then I sent him one final message. "You are not invited. Do not come. Do not contact Elise or the venue. If you appear, you will be removed." He replied instantly. "You'll regret treating your only father this way." I blocked his number. 3 weeks later, on the morning of my wedding, security called from the entrance. A man in a white jacket was outside, demanding to speak to the groom.
I was standing in a small room behind the chapel, trying to fasten my cufflinks when the security guard called. "He says he's your father," the guard said. "He has a garment bag and some kind of speaker." Of course, he had brought his own sound equipment. Through the window, I could see guests crossing the courtyard toward the ceremony. Elise's relatives, our friends, people who had spent months helping us repair what Curtis had damaged. I imagined him forcing his way inside in that white jacket, turning our wedding into the final chapter of his new routine. For 1 second, I wanted to go outside. I wanted to look him in the face and tell him exactly what he had lost. Then I remembered the empty room at the Lantern House. There was nothing left to explain. "Remove him," I said. The guard hesitated. "You don't want to speak with him?" "No." A few minutes later, shouting rose from the entrance. Even through the walls, I recognized Curtis's performance voice. He told security that I was mentally unstable. He said Elise's family had manipulated me. He claimed he had been invited to deliver a surprise tribute and that the groom was suffering from pre-wedding confusion. He tried every version of the story except the truth. Then another voice cut through his, Martin's. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. "You were warned." Curtis grew louder. "I am his father. And today," Martin replied, "you are trespassing." The shouting moved toward the parking lot. A car door slammed. Then the courtyard became quiet again. 10 minutes later, Elise's brother entered the room. "He's gone," he said. I nodded and returned to my cufflinks. My hands were shaking. "Do you need a minute?" "No," I said. "I've given him enough of those." The ceremony began on time. When Elise appeared at the end of the aisle, the fear inside me loosened. She walked toward me slowly, smiling with tears in her eyes, not watching the doors, not waiting for another interruption. For the first time since the engagement dinner, we stood in a room that belonged entirely to us. No one took the microphone unexpectedly. No one told a story without permission. Martin's toast was brief. He welcomed me into the family and said that marriage was not about arriving without scars. It was about trusting someone enough to show them where the scars were. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me like a son. Later, during the reception, I noticed an empty chair near the back. It had not been reserved for Curtis. It was simply a chair no guest had used. Still, I could not stop looking at it. I wondered where he had gone after security removed him. I imagined him sitting in his car, wearing that ridiculous white jacket, rehearsing the story he would tell about the wedding that had rejected him. Maybe he would say rich people had stolen his son. Maybe he would call it censorship. Maybe he would find a new bar, a new audience, and begin again. That thought no longer frightened me. A story only has power over you when you keep entering the room where it is being told. I danced with Elise beneath strings of warm lights. Around us, people laughed for reasons that did not require anyone to be humiliated. Near midnight, my phone vibrated. A message had arrived from an unfamiliar number.
It was a photograph of Curtis standing outside the venue beside the road. His white jacket was open, his portable speaker rested on the pavement, and he was staring toward the windows. Beneath the photograph were 4 words. "You did this to me." I looked at the message for a long time. Then I deleted it. Curtis had spent my entire childhood teaching me that every disaster needed a response, every silence needed a line, and every wound needed an audience. That night, I finally understood he was wrong. Some messages deserved no answer. Some stories deserved no second performance. and some doors became meaningful only after you chose not to open them.
The first week after the wedding was quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet. Peace feels like something has ended. Quiet feels like something is waiting outside the door. Elise and I left for the coast 2 days after the ceremony. We rented a cabin near Cannon Beach, where rain moves sideways across the windows. For the first time in months, nobody needed an explanation from me. We cooked badly, walked along the beach, and slept without checking our phones. Then, on the 4th morning, Elise found an envelope beneath the cabin door. There was no stamp. My name had been written across the front in Curtis's handwriting. Inside was a single page. He did not apologize. He wrote that I had turned his friends against him, poisoned Elise's family, and humiliated him. He said I had always been jealous of his confidence and that the Lantern House proved I was more dangerous than he had ever been. At the bottom, beneath scratched-out sentences, he added, "I hope one day your child does this to you." I read that line twice. Then I carried the letter to the fireplace and held one corner over the flame. Elise stopped me. "Keep it," she said. "Why?" "Because someday you'll remember it differently." She was right. Memory had always been dangerous in my family. Curtis changed details until he became the hero, the victim, or the funniest man in the room. I had spent years doubting things I witnessed because he told them more confidently. So I folded the letter and placed it in my suitcase. Not as a wound, as evidence. When we returned home, the consequences of the video had spread. Curtis's weekly open mic removed him from the lineup. A small theater canceled a charity show he was supposed to host. 2 comedians apologized for repeating his stories about me. Joel deleted the original video, but it had already been copied. Curtis began posting responses. In the first, he called the evening a staged performance. In the second, he said I had suffered another breakdown and invented everything. In the third, he admitted some events were true, but claimed they lacked context. Each version contradicted the last. That had never mattered before. Curtis's confidence usually carried people across the gaps. This time, nobody followed him. A week later, Dennis called me. "I should have known," he said. "You knew enough." He was quiet. "Yes," he admitted. "I think we all did." Dennis said my father had been visiting bars where he used to perform, asking for 5 minutes to explain himself. Most managers refused. One let him speak after closing. Curtis stood on an empty stage and delivered a new routine about being canceled by his ungrateful son. There were 6 people in the room. Nobody laughed. When Dennis told me that, I expected satisfaction. Instead, I pictured my father beneath another spotlight, pushing harder into another silence, still believing the right sentence could restore everything. For the first time, I understood that losing his audience would not change him. It would only make him search for another one. And if he could not find strangers willing to listen, he would eventually come looking for me. Curtis came to our apartment 11 days after we returned. He did not call first. At 7 in the morning, someone began pounding on the lobby door. By the time I reached the intercom, I could hear his voice through the wall. "Tell him I just want 5 minutes." Elise stood behind me, barefoot and pale. I pressed the button. "You need to leave. I brought your things. I don't have anything at your apartment. You have a whole childhood there." He lifted a cardboard box toward the security camera. Inside were the black notebooks. His notebooks, about me. "I thought you'd want your material back," he said. I nearly opened the door. That was the trap. He knew curiosity could do what guilt no longer could. Elise touched my shoulder. "Don't." Curtis heard her. "There she is," he called. "The director. If you don't leave, I'm calling the police." "You'd call the police on your father?" "Yes." When I did not take it back, his voice softened. He said Dennis would not answer, his landlord wanted him out, and he had lost work because of the video. Then he said he had been sober for 9 days. I did not believe him. "You wanted consequences," he said. "Congratulations." "No, you got 'em." He struck the lobby door with his fist. A neighbor opened her apartment and asked whether everything was all right. Curtis immediately became calm. "My son is having an episode," he explained through the glass. "I'm trying to help." There it was. My history, dragged out whenever he needed someone to doubt me. I went downstairs, but I did not unlock the lobby. Curtis stood on the other side of the glass in yesterday's clothes, his hair wet from rain. For 1 second, he looked like the father I had waited for, the one who might admit he was afraid without turning it into a performance. Then he smiled. "I knew you'd come down." He had mistaken my anger for surrender. "What's in the box?" "Every joke I ever wrote about you." "Why bring them here?" "Maybe you can sell them. You're good at using family material now." I called the police. He laughed until I gave the dispatcher his name and said he refused to leave private property. His smile faded. "You really doing this?" "Yes." He kicked the box through the gap beneath the gate. The cardboard split open, scattering notebooks across the wet tile. Then Curtis walked backward into the rain. Before leaving, he pointed at the pages. "That's all you are," he said. I waited until he disappeared. Elise came down and stood beside me. Pages lay open across the floor. I saw dates, names, arrows, crossed-out punchlines. My childhood, reduced to setups and endings. Then one sentence caught my eye. "Mother called again. Do not tell him yet." The entry was dated 2 years after the voicemail Curtis had erased. I turned the page. There were 3 more dates. 3 calls. Beside the last one, Curtis had written, "She wants to see him. Could use this later." Elise crouched beside me without touching the notebook. "There may be more," she said. I stared at the pages. Until that moment, I believed I already knew the worst things my father had taken from me. I was wrong. We carried the notebooks upstairs in silence. There were 19 of them. Some were thin, almost empty. Others had swollen from years of loose pages, receipts, and scraps of paper pushed between the covers. Curtis had dated most entries, which made sorting them easier than I wanted it to be. Elise placed them across the kitchen table. "You don't have to read these tonight," she said. But I already knew I would. The first notebook began when I was 5. Curtis had written down the things children say when they still believe adults are listening because they care. "I want Mom to come home. Dad smells strange today. I don't like the woman sleeping on the couch." Beside each sentence, he had tested different endings. Some entries had stars next to them. Those were the stories that worked best on stage. By the 3rd notebook, my life had become categories: school, fears, mother, money, breakdowns. He had underlined that last word twice. I found notes about the elevator, the spelling contest, and the guitar. There were versions of stories I remembered, but also events I had completely forgotten. A night I locked myself in a closet while Curtis threw plates in the kitchen. A teacher offering to let me stay after school because she did not think I should go home. A neighbor giving me dinner for 4 nights while Curtis was working, though the notebook showed he had been performing at a festival in Boise. He had recorded everything, not with shame, with interest. Near midnight, I reached the pages about my mother. Her name was Dana. Curtis rarely used it. He called her the runaway, the ghost, or simply your mother in the same tone someone might use for a disease. But in the notebooks, he wrote her full name every time. Dana called. Says she is sober. Dana wants an address. Dana says she has a room for him. Dana threatens legal action. The next entry was written in red ink. Told her he refuses contact. She cried. Might be usable. My hands began shaking. Elise reached for the notebook, but I pulled it closer. There was a folded letter taped to the following page. The envelope had already been opened. My name was written on the front. Evan. Inside, my mother had written 4 pages. She said she had entered treatment in Spokane. She had a small apartment and a job at a bakery. She knew she did not deserve forgiveness, but she wanted the chance to tell me the truth herself. She wrote that she sent money every month. She asked whether I received the birthday cards. I had never received money. I had never received a single card. At the end, she included a phone number. I checked the date. The letter had arrived when I was 17. 3 months later, Dana died in a car accident. Curtis had kept the letter for 13 years. He had carried it from apartment to apartment, placing it beside jokes about my abandonment, knowing the entire time that the woman he mocked had been trying to return. Elise read the final paragraph over my shoulder. Your father says you hate me. I understand if that is true, but I need you to hear me say that leaving you was the worst thing I ever did. I folded the letter carefully. The anger I felt was different from what I had felt at the Lantern House. That night, I had wanted Curtis to lose his audience. Now I wanted something impossible. I wanted 17-year-old me to receive the letter on time. I wanted to call the number while someone was still alive to answer. I wanted my father to give back a choice he had stolen so completely that I never knew it existed. At the bottom of the notebook page, beneath the taped envelope, Curtis had written one final note. If Evan ever finds this, say Dana asked me to protect him. For the first time, I understood that my father had prepared jokes for my pain and lies for the day I discovered them.
I did not sleep that night. At dawn, I carried the notebooks into the living room and arranged them in a line across the floor. 19 black rectangles, 19 versions of my life, written by someone who had always believed possession was the same as permission. Elise made coffee and sat beside me. What are you going to do with them? She asked. My first thought was to burn them. I imagined carrying the whole collection into the courtyard, watching flames consume every stolen sentence until nothing remained but wire spirals and ash. But destroying them would have been too much like Curtis. He erased things whenever the truth threatened him. Phone messages, letters, receipts, other people's memories. I wanted the opposite. I'm going to keep them, I said. Elise looked surprised. Not because they're his, I continued, because they're evidence that I wasn't imagining any of it. For most of my life, Curtis had convinced me that every memory was negotiable. If I said he had frightened me, he said I had misunderstood. If I remembered him stealing, he said he had borrowed. If I described cruelty, he called it comedy. The notebooks ended that argument. At 10 in the morning, I called a number written inside Dana's letter. It had been disconnected for years. I knew it would be, but hearing the automated voice still felt like losing her again. Then I searched her name. There were old photographs from the bakery where she had worked. In one, Dana stood behind a counter, holding a tray of cinnamon rolls. Her hair was shorter than I remembered. She looked tired but steady. Another photograph showed her at a recovery fundraiser. She was smiling. Not the reckless smile I remembered from childhood, but a careful one. The expression of someone learning how to exist without running. I found the name of the treatment center and called. A woman answered. I explained that Dana had been a patient many years earlier and that I was her son. The woman could not share records, but after a long silence she said, I remember her. I gripped the phone tighter. She talked about you constantly, she continued. She kept a photograph of a little boy beside her bed. I could not speak. She was trying very hard to become someone who could come back. After the call, I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against a cabinet. Elise lowered herself beside me. For years, I had believed my mother left and forgot me. That belief had shaped everything. The way I distrusted affection, the way I expected people to disappear, the way I accepted Curtis's cruelty, because at least he had stayed. But staying was not the same as loving, and leaving was not always the same as forgetting. Curtis had made sure I confused those things. Around noon, an email arrived from him. The subject line read, "The truth about your mother." The message was 6 pages long. He claimed Dana had been dangerous. He said he hid the letters to protect me. He said she would have destroyed my life if he had allowed her back into it. Then, in the final paragraph, he wrote, "You were all I had. I couldn't risk losing you too." That sentence was the closest he had ever come to admitting the truth. He had not protected me from Dana. He had protected himself from being alone. He had watched me grow up believing my mother did not want me because that lie kept me close to him. I replied with one sentence. You did not keep me, You kept me from leaving. Then I blocked the email address. 3 days later, I received a call from a hospital in Portland. Curtis had collapsed outside a bar. I was still listed as his emergency contact. The nurse asked whether I could come. I looked at the notebooks on the shelf, at Dana's letter resting on top. Then I looked at Elise. For the first time in my life, the decision about my father belonged entirely to me. I told the nurse I would come, not because Curtis deserved it, not because the word father still carried some automatic command. I went because I wanted the choice to be mine, not another decision made by anger, fear, or guilt he had planted years earlier. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Curtis lay beneath a thin blanket with wires attached to his chest. Without the silver jackets, the stage lights, and the microphone, he looked smaller than I remembered. A bruise darkened one side of his face. He opened his eyes when I entered. "You came," he whispered. "I came to hear what the doctor says." He gave a weak smile. "Still making rules." The doctor explained that Curtis had suffered a seizure brought on by alcohol withdrawal. His liver was damaged. If he continued drinking, the next collapse might kill him. Curtis listened with his eyes closed. When the doctor left, he turned toward me. "I need somewhere to stay." "No." The answer came so quickly that it surprised both of us. "Just for a few nights." "No." "I can't go back to my apartment." "Then speak to the hospital social worker." He stared at me. "You'd send your own father to a shelter?" "I'm not taking you home." His face changed. For a second I saw anger, the familiar spark that usually became shouting, insults, or a story about my instability. But he was too weak to perform it. "I said terrible things," he murmured. "You did terrible things. I wasn't always bad." "No? That's what made it confusing." He looked toward the window. Rain moved down the glass in crooked lines. After a long silence, Curtis asked whether I had read the notebooks. "All of them." His breathing became shallow. "And the letters?" "Yes." He covered his face with one hand. "I thought she would take you. She wanted to see me. She left us. She tried to come back. You don't know what she was like. And you made sure I never could." He lowered his hand. There were tears in his eyes, but I did not move closer. For years, every tear had been another trap door. Every moment of weakness became a reason I was required to forgive him before he had admitted what he had done. "I was scared," he said. "So was I. I was a child." That sentence ended the argument. Curtis looked away first. "I don't have anyone," he whispered. It was true. Dennis had blocked him. The comedians had stopped answering. His landlord was changing the locks. The audience he had chosen over me had finally left. But loneliness was not proof of innocence. Sometimes loneliness was simply what remained after a person had used everyone around him. A social worker entered with brochures for rehabilitation centers and temporary housing. Curtis looked at me as she explained the options. He expected me to interrupt, to volunteer, to become the responsible child who had rescued him from consequences 100 times before. I remained silent. When she finished, Curtis pointed toward the papers. "Which one should I choose?" "I don't know." "You always know what to do." "No. I just learned to solve your problems before you made them mine." He closed his eyes. For the first time, I watched my father face a decision without taking control of it for him. I stood. "Are you leaving?" "Yes." "Will you come back?" I thought about Dana's letter, about the wedding, about the voicemail playing through a speaker while strangers laughed. Then I answered honestly, "Not unless you finish treatment and take responsibility for what you did." "I said I was sorry." "No, you said you were scared. Those aren't the same thing." At the door, he called my name. I turned. Curtis looked at me without smiling. "I don't know how to be anything else." For most of my life, that sentence would have been enough to keep me beside him. This time, it was not. "Then learn," I said.
I left the room while the social worker sat beside his bed and opened the first brochure. In the hallway, I waited for guilt to pull me back. It never came. What came instead was grief, not for the father in that hospital bed, but for the father I had spent 30 years hoping might someday appear. I finally understood that letting go of Curtis did not mean I had stopped loving him. It meant I had stopped sacrificing myself to prove that I did. Curtis entered a rehabilitation program 2 days later. I learned that from the social worker, not from him. For the first month, he sent nothing. No letters, apologies, or attempts to turn the hospital into another performance. I did not know whether the silence meant he was changing or simply waiting for a better opening. Elise and I returned to ordinary life. We unpacked wedding gifts. We argued about where to put the coffee machine. We chose photographs for an album and quietly removed every image that showed Curtis outside the venue. The black notebooks remained in a locked cabinet. Sometimes I opened it just to confirm they were still there, not because I wanted to reread them, but because their existence reminded me that the past was no longer something Curtis could rewrite. 3 months after the hospital, a letter arrived. The handwriting was uneven. There were no jokes in the margins. Curtis wrote that his counselor had asked him to describe the difference between telling the truth and taking ownership of someone else's truth. He admitted he had never considered a difference. He said he had spent his life believing pain became harmless when people laughed. If the room laughed, then he had not been cruel, he had been useful. Then he wrote something I had never expected. The room was never laughing because I was funny. It was laughing because I gave it permission not to care about you. I stopped reading. Elise sat beside me while I stared at that sentence. For once, Curtis had named the real thing. He apologized for the engagement dinner, for the stolen money, for Dana's letters, for using my illness whenever he needed people to distrust me. He did not explain why. He did not mention being young or drunk or afraid until the final page, and when he did, he wrote, "Those things explain me. They do not excuse me." At the bottom, he asked whether I would visit. I waited 2 weeks before answering. I told him I was glad he was in treatment, but I was not ready to see him. I said recovery would not restore the childhood he took or give me back the years I could have known my mother. I told him an apology was not a key. It did not automatically reopen every door he had forced me to close. 6 months passed. Curtis finished the program and moved into supervised housing. He found work cleaning a small theater in the mornings. He was not allowed to perform there. According to Dennis, he no longer visited open mics. I do not know whether that was permanent. One Sunday, another envelope arrived. Inside was the final black notebook. The cover was new. Only 1 page had been used. Curtis had written, "Things that happened to Evan belong to Evan." Beneath it was a second sentence. A father should protect the story until his son chooses to tell it. There was no request for forgiveness, no invitation, no closing joke. I placed the notebook beside Dana's letter. Elise found me there and asked whether I wanted to call him. "Not today," I said. "Maybe one day I will. Maybe I will meet him in a quiet cafe with no stage and no microphone. Maybe I will ask questions and listen for answers that do not bend toward an audience. Or maybe the distance between us will remain the healthiest thing either of us ever created. I used to believe forgiveness meant returning to the person who hurt you and proving they no longer had power. Now I think forgiveness can be quieter. Sometimes it means accepting that the past cannot be repaired and refusing to let it decide every future room you enter. My father revealed my darkest secret because he wanted everyone to laugh. I revealed his because I wanted everyone to leave. For a while, I thought that made us the same. But Curtis used truth to trap people inside his performance. I used it to finally walk out of mine. And the most important difference was not who held the microphone. It was what happened after the room became silent. He had always filled silence with another joke. I finally learned to let it stay silent. Then I went home to my wife.